Yes, I'm Ruth Thomas. Grand title of Chief Evangelist. You can tell I work for an American firm. And I work for Payscale. Payscale is an American-based company. We are a data, technology and services company providing compensation management solutions. So we help organizations through our technology manage pay surveys, also build pay ranges, job architecture, job description management, total reward statements, compensation planning. I don't sound very American. I co-founded a company called Curo Compensation, which is how I know some of you in the room. And our products, compensation planning and pay equity, are now sold under the Payscale brand across the world. But we are a large organization. I'm going to share quite a few of data points from our research in the next kind of 10 minutes. We are a data company and we process massive amounts of data. We have one data set which is employee reported data set that has over 40 million data points, and we use that a lot to conduct research around how employees are feeling about things like pay transparency and pay equity. And I'm going to cover three things. I'm going to talk about what we've seen in the US. So Sophie covered how the US legislation in terms of pay transparency, which is at this stage posting ranges in job postings. That's as far as it basically goes at the moment. I'm going to talk about how we've seen employers responding to that, because most of that is like a 2 to 3 year experience that we've been living with in the US. I'm going to talk about one of the big blockers we see is from reward professionals like yourself saying, I can't get leadership buy-in to this. And so I'm going to share some research that we did on high performers, which kind of aligns to, I think, some of the data points that you showed, Lucy, as well from Mercer. And I'm going to close out talking about the opportunity, the gain underneath the Mercer technology, why we should also be thinking about this as an opportunity. And we can start to move from obligation to opportunity when we start talking about the benefits of adopting pay transparency. So lessons from the US. I'm not going to cover this. I am not a lawyer. We do quarterly webinars at Payscale, and I have a legal colleague who joins me, and we keep everybody up to date with developments in pay legislation. We also have a map here, so you can choose which map you want to look at, but we have pages that cover US, Canadian, and European legislation. But this is kind of like the timeline that we've been working to. The first state that affected pay transparency legislation, so that was a requirement to post ranges on job advertisements, was Colorado in 21. And I think this is more, I'm not going to cover all the data points here, but it's just to show the pace of change and how fast this is happening. So there are 5 more, I don't know whether they're all on there. There are 5 more to come into effect and 3 more states waiting to pass. So this is rapidly evolving in the US. So the requirement for employers to get themselves in a position where they feel comfortable about putting pay ranges on job advertisements. And I think that probably puts the fear in many of us sort of sitting in the room here at the moment. The other interesting quirk in the US environment is when you think about remote work, the way the state legislation works is if you are posting a role that can be done remote and therefore could be done in any of the states that currently have legislation, you also have to post the pay range. So it isn't just a case of, am I hiring someone in Colorado or New York State? You have to think about the remote environment as well. So that is forcing employers more generally to think about posting pay ranges in their job postings. And when we survey employers, we see now the majority of them are basically posting wherever they are required to post a job advert, because it's just easier to do that than rather to try and cherry pick the states or work around the different state legislators that there are. I'll pick up Sophie. Oh, she's there. Oh, hidden behind the plant. You talked about the broad ranges. That is being picked up now by the state litigators. The US, each state law is, as far as it normally goes to say, is posting a good faith range. It doesn't say post 80 to 120% of the midpoint of your whatever. So it's up to you to define what you think is a good faith range. And that's where we have seen employers. The famous one was a Citibank one. Hopefully there's someone from Citibank in the room. That actually, the story behind that, where they posted a pay range of something from 0 to 10 million, I think it was it was a system error. So it was actually their HRIS error. So, but anyway, lots of stories I can tell you about companies. So what we're seeing in terms of how employers are responding to this in the US. So this is now 3 years of lived experience. And I'm going to call out 3 key things. Job architecture. So that was something that we were all talking about. We've seen at the enterprise level, larger organizations simplifying their job architecture structures, reviewing them in the way that you're saying, like just to broad pay bands, give us what we need in terms of being able to compare value across organizations, and really trying to set themselves up for being in, for pay ranges being in the public domain. The middle one is one of my favorite topics, and one that I'm enjoying in sort of intellectualizing about at the moment, is if you're going to be transparent about pay, you're going to have to be able to explain the factors that differentiate pay within your organization. And we all kind of think we do that, performance, experience. When you do pay equity analysis, one of the most common or the most reliable factor that you can use in terms of doing, a formal pay equity analysis is level. And that will probably remain as a compensable factor. But things like experience, people are starting to question the value of experience as a compensable factor. Most of us probably, when we define experience within an organisation, we're using someone's start date and not time in role. And really time in role is something that's probably more relevant for organisations to think about. There's been a lot of headlines this year around education. So you've probably seen the headlines around skills-based hiring, where organisations are focusing on potentially dropping degree requirements for certain jobs. In the US, 47% of employers last year dropped educational requirements on not all roles, but some roles within their organisations. And so, will education be something that we use to differentiate pay and say, because you've got a degree, you're going to be paid this much more as an entry requirement? Performance has just always been a very difficult compensable factor. But when we survey employers, when we ask them what is it that you use to differentiate pay, 80% of them say performance. So it's still the predominant compensable factor that people are using in the US. But I think, one of the things I would say to you as you begin this journey now is question, within our pay philosophy, what do we say are the factors that differentiate why we pay John different than Fred? And, get comfortable with that. And then also think about how your workplace is changing and how skills are transforming and what those compensable factors might need to be in the future. So I'd say the majority of the work for the last couple of years in US organisations has been focusing on job architecture. And what we're seeing now declared as like the 2025 challenge is pay conversations. So this is the one that we're hearing most as we interact with customers and then we interact on our webinars and in our client sessions. So they're concerned now, they've done the hard work about kind of building their pay structures, being ready to communicate pay transparency. Now it's how do I get to the point of actually delivering that message and how do I enable managers to deliver that message? So that's kind of the key areas of experience that we're seeing happening within organisations. I'm going to share some data points. So we do a big annual survey called the Compensation Best Practice Report. We survey over 5,000 practitioners, and it's an annual report. We go out to fielding on the 1st of November, I think, for the 25 study. This is data from the 24 study that was released in March. This is a 15-year-old study, so it's great for me because I'm trying to track trends and how are people responding to pay transparency legislation. So we took a number of data points. One of them was to see how one of the key factors we can see is compensation maturity is advancing as people seek to comply with pay transparency legislation. And so what this slide is showing, you see the blue bar here is the number of people that are adopting a formal compensation strategy and implementing pay ranges. So in the US, if you're familiar with the US market, in mid to small organisations, job-based market pricing is probably the most common approach to to defining what the pay for a role should be. And job-based pricing is a nightmare if you're going to start thinking about how jobs are valued across an organisation. And so many of them are building pay ranges and building these compensation strategies for the first time in the US. We also ask organisations in this study, how are you responding to pay transparency legislation? And it's interesting to see the jump in practice from 23 to 2024. So we could see in 24, it looks like it's kind of dropped the number of people who are trying to improve their pay data and structures. But that's because we saw a jump in the number of people who say they are now have pay transparency within their organisation. So you can see all that hard work that has been going on where organisations have been focusing on getting their house in order, ready to adopt transparency and publish those ranges. This was an interesting one where we saw a jump in the number of people in 24 resisting pay transparency. We think the reason for that is because there are just more states now that have legislation, so there are probably more people to resist. We're also asking employers what the employee response has been, because that's a very important part of this discussion. Still 52% saying they haven't heard anything from their employees yet. I'm sure that will change, or maybe they haven't asked them. But we do see a lot more where employees have been asking more questions about their pay. And then this interesting one where we've got employees have left our organisation because they saw job postings with higher ranges elsewhere. And that's one big fear that many employers have around posting those ranges. Now, as I said, one of the key barriers we see when people are trying to implement a pay transparency strategy within their organisation is leadership buy-in. And how do I build a business case for this? So I know I've got to do it from an obligation perspective, but how do I persuade my business that we really need to do this? So we took our big compensation best practice report, and in that we asked organisations to declare whether they exceeded their revenue goals in 23, met them, didn't exceed them. And we said, why don't we just take a look at all the people that said they exceeded their revenue goals in 23 and try and see if we can look at what are the compensation practices of that subgroup, and can we learn from that. So 20% of our survey said that they exceeded their revenue goals. There's a lot of words on this chart, and you've got that to go away. You can also read this report here. But if we look down the central column, which is kind of pertinent to what we're here to discuss today, the top performing companies are more likely to embrace pay transparency and share pay ranges. They're more likely to provide always accessible information to employees. They're more likely to use total reward modules within purpose-built comp technology. They will line item pay increases on their compensation statement. So they'll say, is it merit, is it a promotion, is it market adjustment? And then they're more likely to be proactive about addressing unfair pay. Yeah. So did they have a similar picture? Yes. No. So what we did is we looked at the biggest differentiators, basically. So here, what we were trying, because we tried to say where were the biggest differences, and those 11 factors on that prior slide were there. So when it came to pay transparency, we can see there was a 14% difference between top performing companies in terms of their likelihood to be more transparent, to either share individual pay ranges with employees or to publish pay ranges within the organisation. So that was quite a big difference. And then we also saw the biggest differentiating factor was that they were more likely to provide always accessible information to employees about the what and the why behind their pay. So we can have an argument about causation and correlation. I'm not a mathematician, but it's that compensation maturity is, I think we all know as raw professionals in the room is like what is driving high performance within the business. And I think this was kind of useful data for some of our customers who were looking to build their business cases around why we should adopt pay transparency.
Sorry, another question. So,
yep.
So we actually provide employees with a complete statement of what we pay them, the benefits as well. And so absolutely fully aligned with that. I think for me, with the pay transparency, and the reason I apologise for being negative, if I really am not a negative individual, but it's the administrative
yep.
burden bit of it that's really got my
yep.
heckled up a bit. It's not why we don't. It's not a
Yeah, I mean, you've got to think about the workflow of, the implication of posting a pay range on a job advert. You could just go out and do that, but you've got to think about the incumbents within the job. You've got to think about other employees who might look at that advert and go, well, hang on, that job is about the same level as mine. Why is that person being paid that? You've got to think about your competitor, being able to see that data. So, but I think it's taking that leap of faith around like knowing that you have kind of done the work internally to make sure that you've cleaned up your pay structures, that you've addressed pay inequities within your business so that you feel confident. Like if I post that range, I am comfortable that that employee over there is going to look at this, or the employees within that job are going to look at that. And I think you've got to get to that point of comfort.
So it's interesting, we'll post a range. What we don't if there's a variable incentive with it, maybe a benefit like a card scheme or something, we post that. But, if I look at the pay directive, it goes beyond that. It's
Yes,
time,
locked.
looking, suddenly, so it's more, I think a lot of the things that you're saying, a lot of us here will do. Again, coming back to the directive, it's going even further than that.
Yep.
That's really the challenge, I think, and how my company responds to that challenge.
Yeah, so like the employee being able to ask for the average pay of,
Exactly.
So, okay, I'll keep going. I had a thought, but I've lost it. Right, we're going to close out on the gain, as Lucy and Lucy were talking about, or why I talk about the opportunity of pay transparency and not to lose sight of this. And I think this is our obligation in terms of supporting our business as reward professionals. Pay transparency is a powerful lever to drive trust and improve employee engagement. I think of the equation of trust in pay practices, equates to trust in management, it equates to employee engagement and retention, and equates to business outcomes. And you need to join that thread. And we have data to support the impact of pay transparency on employees and their intent to leave. So I was just going to close out sharing those data points. So the biggest problem here is unless we communicate to employees about how their pay is determined and what their pay is, they will just make up their own mind and they will create their own story. So we did this interesting study, it's probably 3 or 4 years old now, but we looked within our employee reported database and we asked people how did they think they were paid according to market. So you've got the people that are paid above market, people who are paid at market, people who are paid below market. And we asked them how they thought they were paid, and then we obviously knew how they were paid against market because we have the market data. And you can see overwhelmingly, everybody thought, whichever category they were in, they were paid below market. I mean, I know it's a natural thing. How many of us would say we're underpaid, I mean, how many of us would say we're overpaid? None of us probably, but, and that only down that light blue, 14, 7% and 4%. So if you don't tell that story to employees, then you're at risk of perception of fair pay really impacts intent to leave. So we asked all those employees, would you think about leaving your employer in the next 6 months? And for all those people who believed that they were paid below market, 65.8% of them had flagged, yeah, I intend to leave my employer in the next 6 months. And then we did another study last summer, our retention report, where we asked employees to declare the level of transparency in their organisation, and again correlated that with their intent to leave. And we can see the more transparent an organisation is, the less the intent to leave happens. So again, if you're thinking about changing your culture and how pay transparency can impact engagement in your organisation, then these metrics about how employees are thinking are important as well. Jumping out of Payscale data, obviously we've now had 3 years of pay transparency compliance, probably two years of pay transparency compliance happening in the US. We're starting to see people surveying to see what the other impact can be of pay transparency legislation. So ZipRecruiter, one of the big US recruiting platforms, they've observed some very positive movement in the talent acquisition space. So generally employers are saying they have more applicants, they have better quality applicants, and time to hire reduces when pay range is actually put in a job posting. The other interesting point to note in the US, Indeed, or one of the hiring platforms, if you don't post a range, they will use their algorithm to post one for you. Now, what's more scary, you posting what your range should be or relying on Indeed's algorithm to do that? And then SHRM, the Society of Human Resource Management in the US, slightly controversial organisation right at the moment. We can talk about that later. But they did a study and saw that 75% of US workers are more likely to trust an organisation that provides salary ranges in job postings, and 65% of organisations that list pay ranges on job postings say that it makes them more competitive. And then the other data, I loved this study from LinkedIn that was actually back in 2022. But when we think about, one of the things I observe often with organisations are the people who are making the decisions about whether we should be transparent or not are normally here, or the elder millennials. Who's an elder millennial in the room? Yes, Lucy's an elder millennial. I'm a young Gen X, mid Gen X. But this study is quite interesting because it shows perceptions of different generations in terms of who they would be prepared to disclose their pay information with. So you can see most people comfortable with telling their family members what they're paid, but if we jump down to anyone who asks, it's only your Gen Z and your millennials, 34 and 24%, whereas like my category here, 7% of us are only going to be happy sharing information, and even less in the baby boomer category. So as you think about rolling out strategies within your organisation and communication strategies and employee expectations, you do need to consider the diversity in your workforce and the diversity of expectation. By 2030, 30% of our workforce will be Gen Z. So we do need to be kind of considering that. And I'm going to leave you with my checklist, which is very similar to the ones you've seen before. I would call out the top two really as the biggies, which is getting that executive buy-in is a key component to success in kind of adopting pay transparency and being compliant. And then creating this roadmap. So I think, Sally, you had it in your deck. My background is in reward in the financial services sector. If there was a big regulatory change coming into the financial sector, would there be a task force in your organisation that would be set up, a multidisciplinary task force, to address those regulatory changes? Yes. So we should be thinking about the same thing here. So, start engaging with your legal counsel, your external counsel, start engaging with your risk and compliance functions internally, and creating that kind of gap analysis of where you are now. And I know we don't have the definitions of all the law, but we can use the EU pay transparency as a guide and kind of just like do that gap analysis of where we are today and where we need to get to, because that is a risk analysis that you need to do.